Inscryption. Ooh.
I've been wanting to talk about Inscryption's death card for a hot minute now. It's been in my notes for like a year at this point, and I wound up replaying it last week, so I thought, screw it, let's finally get to it. Let's talk about my favorite roguelike mechanic, maybe ever. The death card in Inscryption is one of your main carryovers between runs. Carryovers are what I call currencies, items, or upgrades that contribute to your meta progression in roguelikes, the stuff that sticks with you when you die or stays permanently unlocked or something, and I call them carryovers because they carry over. You know what, maybe I don't need to get into the etymology of everything. You're pretty smart. You can probably understand how a fellow intellectual like myself managed to come to this conclusion. Now, every roguelite has different carryovers. Sometimes it's incidental, sometimes it's something that you choose, and sometimes it can be manipulated or improved through certain actions. For example, in Hades or Blade Assault, you can choose between 2 or sometimes 3 paths at the end of every room, and it'll tell you which reward you get if you make it through, be it health or currencies or upgrades for your current run, which will never ripple out and affect future runs at all, or it can be currency or unlocks that do affect the rest of the game, so if you want, you can target meta progression in your runs. I tend to start doing this if a run isn't going super well and I feel like I won't go too far. Maybe I'll try and heal a few times to keep myself afloat, but mostly I'll enter rooms that'll help me in future runs so that my current one doesn't feel like a total waste. Of course, like everything in a roguelite, randomization needs to play a part in all this. There needs to be some element of not having full control over what happens to you. In the games I mentioned earlier, that randomization comes from having no control over which rewards are offered in these rooms to begin with, even if you can decide which of the offered rewards to pick from. Although I will say that this system still skews favorably to the player because every option shows up fairly regularly, so you do end up with a decent amount of control. Dead Cells does something a little bit different. It gives you control over what to spend your cells on to unlock certain features or weapons, but most of the things you unlock will be appearing randomly. So the control element and random element is a bit more equal, but decisions are also not as spontaneous, nor are they really difficult. Usually when I end a level, I already know which item I'm going to be putting my cells into before I even open up the menu. Other forms of meta progression could be shortcuts like how Rogue Legacy 2 lets you skip biomes, or the discount system in Have a Nice Death where performing certain actions in your runs will make permanently unlocking weapons and spells cheaper. These are all to make the game easier, but they're also all incentives to keep you playing and make every run feel like it matters, so if you get bounced on the same boss 5 times in a row, it doesn't feel like you're making zero progress. And usually roguelites will have a good handful of complementing meta progression systems to balance everything out. Now I like all of these systems for their respective games, but the death card in my opinion has the best balance of randomization, choice, individual run importance, and impact on your moment-to-moment choices out of anything I've played, and it does it all in the most compact package as well. At the end of every attempt in Inscryption Act 1, and if it wasn't clear by now, we are only going to be talking about Act 1 here, you're given the chance to create a death card, essentially a lasting echo of your latest valiant attempt at victory. The death card is created using 3 other cards in your deck and then slamming them together to make a new, unique card. Now you might be thinking to fully understand the death card that you need to know exactly how Inscryption's card-based combat works, but honestly, don't even worry about that. Really, all you need to know is that there are 4 main aspects that every card has, and that's attack power, health, sigils, and cost. Obviously, the lower the cost and the higher the attack power or health, the better, but the real X factor is the card sigils. These are essentially unique effects. Some cards will attack in 2 or 3 directions instead of just straightforward, others will evolve over time, others create a replica of themselves in your hand when they die, and cards can have more than one sigil as well. Throughout your run, you'll encounter a whole bunch of cards with different stats and sigils, and when you die, you're given the opportunity to pick apart elements of your deck for a death card. You'll first get a random assortment of 3 cards to choose the cost from, then an assortment of 3 cards to choose the power and health from, and finally 3 cards to choose the sigils from. You Frankenstein that all together, and there you have it, your death card. When you start your next run though, the card isn't given to you off the bat. You start with the same basic deck each time, but it can appear later in a run as part of a random choice between regular cards or a choice between death cards specifically, as can every previous death card that you've made to date. As you get better and better, farther and farther, and get more powerful cards, you can create some insane death cards and sometimes get them really early on. Ones that combine powerful offensive sigils with high base stats and a low cost. There's a clear kind of non-linear progression of how good your death cards get over time. For the most part, they get better, but sometimes they're total duds, and you'll find yourself playing the game in a different way once you realize just how powerful of a tool these can be. Inscryption's map lets you go down a few divulging and intersecting paths to get to the end of a particular section, and the stops along along those paths are shown to you beforehand. My choices on where to go would shift a lot depending on how I felt about my current run, and the death card played a key part in that. For example, I wasn't the biggest fan of trapping and trading most of the time, but sometimes it can be really beneficial if you look at it through a certain lens. Here's a quick explanation of this whole system. Basically, the game has an icon that represents a trapper, which will exchange a certain currency for pelts of different rarities that get added to your deck, and then later you might find a trader who will exchange those pelts for useful cards. The better the pelt, the better the cards. The reason I would avoid this sometimes is because I felt like the time between a trapper and trader was sometimes a bit too much to justify how bloated my deck would get with pelts in between. Because pelts were treated as regular cards that you could pick up from the deck and use, but they did no damage. At best, they were a way to block an attack or delay your own offense. But because they're just regular cards, they also have a chance to pop up in your death card selection with the sweet, sweet price of absolutely nothing. So what started off as a really simple decision that I would usually turn down turned into, okay, maybe I should get some pelts, see if there's a trader down the road, and then if not, then maybe it'll be available in my death card selection. Maybe I'm late in a run, I have crappy cards, I'm 1 life down already, I don't feel great about my current situation, but I have a couple of high-powered cards, and I specifically pick up pelts so I can purposefully die with them and have a low cost. But of course, you have to decide whether that's worth it to you, because there's no guarantee they're going to be offered as one of the cards you can use to make your death card, much less for the option of cost specifically, and there's probably no worse feeling than when you get 3 pelts for the attack and damage selection. There's another mechanic in Inscryption that lets you create genetic abominations, slicing up and attaching 2 identical cards into one that combines their power and health. It kind of looks like that one scene in SpongeBob where the animators decided to scar children across the nation. And of course, it's nice doing this with cards that have great base stats, but those are usually the cards with the highest costs. It is an improvement to your deck, but is it enough to get you to take a path that might have other less appealing stops on the way when you could just pick a more well-rounded route? Well, how about the added incentive that in a death card, if this card does show up, the cost will not be associated with it. It's going to inherit the cost and sigil of 2 other cards. Is that enough to convince you? Maybe, maybe not. Either way, it's definitely a factor. There's also a map icon that lets you sacrifice 1 card to pass its sigils onto another card. Technically, a card can have 4 different sigils, which can make it an absolute tank, but I noticed that cards with more than 2 sigils never appeared in the sigil selection options for death cards, so sometimes I would try to create a few high-powered cards and a few solid 2 sigil cards all in one run so they could be combined in a death card with an even lower cost in future runs. But other times I'll be like, screw it, why do I care about my death card? This is a good run, I should try and create the best immediate deck possible. That way I'll probably even accidentally end up with a decent set of options. No matter what I choose, whether I decide to make choices that will make later runs easier or ones that would push me over the edge this time, this carryover was always in the back of my head when I made any decision during the game. I am able to manipulate the outcome to a degree, but I'm also still at the mercy of whichever options the game decides to offer me, and plus, who knows if and when I'll see this death card again, so it's not like I could 100% focus on creating an army of past defeats to easy mode the game. It feels like it occupies just the right amount of space in my mind. It offers enough of an advantage as the game goes on while not being entirely under your control, while still being somewhat targetable, while sometimes completely sucking and driving you to play another run. It's pretty impressive how it can let you walk away with a pile of straight up, unadulterated nothing, but still shows enough promise that you don't feel like you wasted your time, you just got unlucky. One death card can be John Wick on steroids, and the next can be a pelt that costs 3 blood sacrifices to use and attacks in 2 directions, except it doesn't even have an attack, so fuck you. And you just kind of have to deal with it. There are other carryovers in Inscryption as well. Beating bosses gives you one-time use abilities for every run, and if you engage with Act 1's locked room, you can get your hands on a better starting deck and other useful items. Not to mention unlocking how to actually move on to Act 2, but really, if the game took all of this out and just kept the death card mechanic, it would still have a very well-balanced, effective roguelite loop. In fact, the way I play it, it might as well just have the death card. I don't really use any of the other tools and kind of just do the locked room stuff for mandatory progression now. I think it's a pretty fantastic idea for a pretty fantastic game, and I just wanted to give it a little bit of love here. Anyways, sorry for making you guys wait almost a whole week for like an 8-minute video. I have longer ones in the works. I'm just suffering from writer's block, but hopefully those will be out soon. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like. If you're new here, subscribe. Join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.